Hello, and welcome to the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration public meeting for the draft air tour management plan for Bryce Canyon National Park. My name is Michelle Carter. I'm an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. I'm going to start off by defining a couple of acronyms that you'll hear us use throughout the meeting. You'll hear us refer to the National Park Service as the NPS, the Federal Aviation Administration as the FAA, and the Air Tour Management Plans as ATMPs. We'll define the remaining acronyms as we go along. Next slide, please. We're holding this virtual public meeting to review the draft ATMP for Bryce Canyon and to seek public feedback on the draft. This meeting is being held pursuant to the National Parks Air Tour Management Act of 2000, also known as NPATMA, and its implementing regulations. You'll hear a little bit more about NPATMA and the draft ATMP here shortly, along with more information on how you could submit questions and official comments. But before we dive into the presentations, I'd like to take a minute and introduce our presenters and provide you with a little bit more information about meeting logistics and how you can participate. So joining us this evening as presenters are Keith Lusk, Federal Aviation Administration Program Manager and Special Programs Staff with the Western Pacific region. From the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division of the National Park Service, we have Vicki Ward, Overflights Program Manager. And from Bryce Canyon National Park, we have the Park Superintendent, Jim Ireland. Keith and Vicki are going to give us a brief overview of NPATMA and the purpose of today's meeting. And then we'll hear from Superintendent Ireland, who will share information from the park's perspective and discuss park-specific resources along with the draft ATMP. Next slide, please. So throughout the meeting, we invite you to submit your questions, which we'll address after the presentations as part of the Q&A session at the end. Questions submitted through the meeting today will be considered by the agencies as they continue developing the draft ATMP, but they won't be considered formal comments. Next slide. Official comments that would be included in the record should be submitted through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment site, or PEPC as we call it, or sent to the mailing addresses that are listed on the park's PEPC site. Only comments received through one of these two avenues will become part of the official record, and they must be submitted on or before October 3rd. The agencies are not accepting official comments via email, and we'll share a little bit more about the commenting process later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So the meeting is being live streamed across Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and if you're watching on one of these platforms, you can submit your questions using the link to a Google form. The FAA is going to post into the chat area of whichever platform you're using. When the time comes, we'll read your question aloud and the presenters will do our best to respond. And we're also going to do our best to get to all of the questions, but in the event that we don't get to your question, we will provide contact information at the end where you can go for post-meeting follow-up. And so if you happen to just be listening in, you may want to have a pen handy toward the end of the meeting so you can jot down the number. We're planning for the meeting to be 90 minutes long, and we will adjourn at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. If we get through all of the questions early, we'll keep the meeting active until 4 o'clock, just in case additional questions come in. And please note this meeting is being recorded. We appreciate you joining us this afternoon to learn more about Bryce's draft ATMP. And we're going to now play a short video overview before turning it over to Keith and Vicki to provide additional details about NPATMA and why we're here today.
The United States is home to some of the most breathtaking national parks and tribal lands in the world. It is important that we protect these lands while ensuring that the public has ample opportunity to enjoy these national treasures. Air tours offer the public a totally different type of experience. The Federal Aviation Administration and the National Park Service work together to manage air tours over national parks. We are developing plans that help protect wildlife, wilderness character, cultural resources, natural soundscapes, and visitor enjoyment. These plans are known as Air Tour Management Plans, and today we will explore the specifics of the draft plan for your park. As part of our planning process, we consult with tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, state and tribal historic preservation officers, and wildlife biologists. We assess noise, wildlife protection, and other environmental considerations, and we will continue to make adjustments to these plans as needed. And we consider the appropriate level of National Environmental Policy Act review for these plans. The FAA and the National Park Service are committed to ensuring safe flights at our national parks while safeguarding park resources. Following today's presentation, we encourage you to review your park's draft Air Tour Management Plan and provide official comments through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment website. Together, we can celebrate these special places and ensure they can be enjoyed for generations to come.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Lusk, and I'm a program manager with the Federal Aviation Administration, and I'm here today with my colleague from the National Park Service, Vicki Ward. We're going to provide you with a little background and context regarding the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, as well as Air Tour Management Plans, or ATMPs in general. Next slide, please. The National Parks Air Tour Management Act was enacted in April of 2000 with subsequent amendment provisions provided in 2012. Basically, at a high level, what the National Parks Air Tour Management Act does is it requires the Federal Aviation Administration, in cooperation with the Park Service, to develop an air tour management plan for those parks and tribal lands where operators have applied to conduct commercial air tours. It's important to note what air tour management plans apply to and what they do not apply to. They are very specific about regulating commercial air tour operations, and that is what the Act applies to, only that type of aviation activity. Also only applies to commercial air tours that are over a national park unit or within a half-mile boundary of that park unit, or over tribal lands that are within the park or abutting a park. Also, in terms of the altitude of the airspace over the park and the buffer, it only applies to commercial air tour operations that are being conducted or transiting through the airspace from basically ground level to 5,000 feet above ground level. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, it only applies to commercial air tour operations. The Act does not apply to, nor does an air tour management plan apply to, commercial airline activity, military flights, or any type of general aviation activity. It also does not apply to any national park units in Alaska. When the original legislation came out in 2000, it specifically exempted all national park units in Alaska from the provisions of this Act. It also does not apply to Grand Canyon National Park, although there is a number of commercial air tour operators and operations being conducted at Grand Canyon National Park. That is covered under separate legislation. It also does not apply to Rocky Mountain National Park. Rocky Mountain National Park was specifically prohibited from allowing commercial air tour operations in the original legislation of 2000. As I mentioned before, in 2012, there were some amendment provisions provided to the original Act. One of the amendment provisions exempted lower activity park units from requiring the requirement to have to develop an air tour management plan. The criteria was that if there were 50 or fewer annual air tour operations at a park, they would be exempt from having to do an air tour management plan. However, there was a provision that if the National Park Service wanted to withdraw that park from the exempt park list, they could do so if they thought that there was still a need to develop a plan to either protect park resources or visitor experience or effects to tribal lands. Bryce Canyon National Park is not on the exempt park list. It has far greater than 50 annual air tour operations, and therefore the agencies are in the process of developing an air tour management plan. And we have obviously a draft ATMP out for public review at this point. Also, as I mentioned before, if abutting tribal lands are or may be overflown in the conduct of an air tour over a national park unit, the agencies are required to invite the tribe in as a cooperating agency for purposes of compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. I'll talk a little bit more about the environmental compliance associated with air tour management plan developed in some later slides. Next slide, please. The Act makes a distinction between two types of operators. Basically, the Act required commercial air tour operators to apply to the FAA for what is called operating authority in order for them to conduct tours over national park units or abutting tribal lands. Most operators did that back in the early 2000s, right after the Act came into effect and the FAA promulgated the rule as part of Part 136, 14 CFR Part 136. Basically, one of the types of air tour operators are called existing operators, and those are operators that had been conducting tours over national park units before the Act came into effect. So they were conducting tours before April of 2000. The air tour operators at Bryce Canyon are all considered existing air tour operators. They've been operating over Bryce Canyon for decades. They were the 6 operators in the plan were operating prior to the year 2000. What the FAA granted them was something called Interim Operating Authority, and that was based on the number of tours that respective operator had conducted in the year prior to enactment of the Act. So the Act came into effect in 2000. So it was either based on the number of tours that operator did in 1999 or on the number of tours as part of a 3-year average from 1997 to 1999. The other type of air tour operator is a new entrant commercial air tour operator. That's an operator that would have applied to the FAA to conduct air tours over a park after enactment of the Act. So someone who was not flying prior to April 2000, but applied to the FAA for operating authority after that time. Next slide, please, and I'll pass it over to my colleague, Vicki Ward.
Thanks, Keith. And welcome to those who are watching our virtual public meeting. I'm Vicki Ward from the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division in the National Park Service, and I will continue the overview of NEPATMA. Air tour management plans are required by NEPATMA, as was mentioned earlier, and that objective of what the air tour management plan is to achieve is also from the Act. And that is to develop acceptable and effective measures to mitigate or prevent the significant adverse impacts, if any, resulting from commercial air tour operations upon natural and cultural resources, visitor experiences, and tribal lands. Next slide. The contents of an air tour management plan are also contained in the Act, and there's several things that an air tour management plan can contain, depending on what the Objectives are for the park, and they include may prohibit commercial air tour operations in whole or in part. It may also establish conditions for the conduct of the air tour operations that include the routes, the altitudes, time of day restrictions, restrictions for particular events, such as a ceremony or other special event, and the maximum number of flights that could be on a daily basis, so weekly, yearly, seasonal basis. And under the interim operating authority, that's presently the only thing that's capped at under the interim operating authority is the number of flights. There are no routes or altitudes, so that's what an air tour management plan can establish. The air tour management plan just applies to commercial air tour operations that are within 1/2 mile outside the boundary of a national park or below 5,000 feet above ground level. And an air tour management plan must also include incentives for the adoption of quiet aircraft technology. These are models of aircraft or helicopters and fixed wing that are quieter than standard aircraft, and the definitions of those are in FAA guidance that has been published back in 2005. An air tour management plan also must provide for the allocation of the opportunities to conduct the air tours when the air tour management plan limits the number of operations. And then each air tour management plan justifies and documents the needs for the measures taken, such as the routes or the altitudes, the maximum number of flights that are prescribed in that air tour management plan, and that is also included in the record of decision for each air tour management plan. Next slide. This is a map of the United States in case someone's calling in, you can't see the screen. We're working on air tour management plans for 24 parks right now. They're spread across the United States. They're mostly concentrated in the Western US, but we have a couple parks in the eastern area of the United States, and like Great Smokies and Everglades National Parks. And then obviously we've got a pretty good cluster in Utah here, and we're here for Bryce Canyon National Park today. We will be holding more public meetings and other information forthcoming on other air tour management plans coming up. We're also working on air tour management plans for Mount Rushmore Badlands, Olympic, and Mount Rainier, 4 parks in the San Francisco area, and also Haleakala and Hawaii Volcano National Parks in Hawaii. Next slide. For each air tour management plan, the Act requires that a notice be published in the Federal Register to announce the availability of the draft plan. We hold at least one public meeting to get public input on the draft plan. And as mentioned earlier, we also comply with the National Environmental Policy Act and other legal requirements such as National Historic Preservation Act and Endangered Species Act. And where applicable, we invite tribes to participate as cooperating agencies for NEPA compliance in cases where tribal lands are or may be overflown. And as we mentioned earlier, the purpose of our meeting today is to review the components of the draft air tour management plan for Bryce Canyon National Park. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Michelle. Thank you.
Great. Thank you guys very much for that wonderful overview. And now I'd like to turn it over to Superintendent Ireland to hear more about park resources and the draft ATMP.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks to all of you for your interest in Bryce Canyon and for taking time out this afternoon to join us in this process and this important but complex issue. You know, Bryce will celebrate its centennial as a national park unit in 2023, marking a century of protecting this amazing place, which is enjoyed by millions of people from around the world every year. In the early years of the park, only a handful of visitors arrived over rough roads or trail by car or horse. But today we welcome almost 3 million recreational visitors each year in search of beauty, inspiration, relaxation, and adventure. Over the decades of management, this park and others like it have had to adapt to growth in visitation and changing recreational opportunities, new technologies, and new trends. This isn't always easy, and today's topic demonstrates that. But finding common ground is always a good starting place. And I hope that all of us can agree on our common love of this place, of our national parks in general, and a common respect for everyone on this call, everyone involved in this issue who share that love with us. Together, we can work through this and come up with I think, a workable and viable plan. Next slide, please. Oh, Bryce Canyon National Park is located in southwestern Utah in Garfield and Kane counties. And as the slide notes, we preserve 35,835 acres. I should note that it's not a true canyon. If you have never been here before, it's rather a series of eroded amphitheaters along the eastern edge or the escarpment of the Paunsaugunt Plateau. And within these amphitheaters, of course, are world famous eroded rock formations, typically known as hoodoos, which draw these millions of visitors to their brilliant colors and tremendous beauty, natural quiet, and the wildlife of the park. Along the rim of the amphitheaters are multiple overlooks and viewpoints connected by 78 miles of hiking trails that take visitors down through the formations themselves, as well as all along the rim to look down into them. Just to put the size of the park into perspective, it is the smallest of Utah's 5 national park designated national parks, otherwise known as the Mighty Five. Zion National Park is about 4 times the size of Bryce Canyon, and Arches is twice our size. If we went over to Canyonlands, we could fit 7 parks the size of Bryce into that park. And if we traveled south to Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, we'd find that it's 35 times our size. I find this relevant to what we're talking about today because this is a relatively small space with a lot of visitors. And so air tours are also trying to share the same airspace to get the same views of these hoodoos and these other formations. So as we're looking at maps and things, it appears we're trying to accommodate many uses in a small area. Next slide, please. So as we're looking now at a map of the outline of Bryce Canyon, the heavy dark line is our boundary. On the eastern edge of the park, you'll notice a green hashed area. This is significant. I'm highlighting it with the pointer on my computer here. The green hashed area is the park's about 20,000 acres of recommended wilderness area. This is area that was found to be suitable for wilderness, formally recommended to the Congress, and by policy, the National Park Service treats it as wilderness. So this is an area where visitors seek solitude and natural quiet. Is below the rim of the escarpment, the non-hatched areas is where you'll find roads and overlooks. The bright green dot on the map here is the Park Visitor Center, just for reference. And at the top of the map with the small airplane icon is the Bryce Canyon Airport. The red line crossing through the northern end of the park is State Route 12. So of note, given this long, narrow configuration of the park, even with the provision that the air tour management plan applies within a half mile of the park boundary, as a purely practical matter, it's difficult to effectively restrict or completely eliminate sight and sound of aircraft from park viewpoints, recommended wilderness or other areas. As I've already said, given the small size of the park, this is a planning and management challenge. And as we'll discuss as we go forward, one of our proposed solutions to this is to increase the minimum altitude of aircraft above ground level. Next slide, please. We've already mentioned the hoodoos and the geology of the Claron Foundation, for which the park is best known. But like all national parks, Bryce Canyon preserves and protects much more. Native Americans throughout this region understand the park and its landscapes as their homeland and their heritage. They continue to visit, to honor, and to utilize the land as they and their ancestors have done for centuries. Historic structures and trails, many significant enough to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, preserve the story of early pioneers, including those of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who came into this area in the later 1800s, as well as the early development of tourism in the Western US. The park is known for wildlife, including over 100 bird species, 1,000 plant species, mammals ranging in size from elk and black bear to pronghorn and the Utah prairie dog. More than that, though, are other less tangible but equally important resource values, including the opportunity for natural quiet, the ability to view a dark, starry sky, and clear scenic views across the wide Western landscape. These last resources I mentioned are often the hardest to manage. They require us to work with partners outside our boundaries, and they involve slow and incremental change. And sometimes the change isn't even realized until it's too late to change course. But through planning efforts like this ATMP, though difficult, we can take action to change those directions and prevent adverse impacts. Next slide, please. So as Keith mentioned, recognizing that it would take time to develop this air tour management plans after the law was passed, we did have a provision to provide interim operating authorities. And as you can see from this slide, the total number of IOAs granted in 2000 was 3,131 flights per year for up to 9 operators. At this time, 6 of those operators have reported flying commercial tours from the 2017 to 19 period. So looking at the 3-year average of that reporting data from 2017 to 2019, and not including 2020, frankly, because it was an abnormal year with the COVID pandemic that we're all suffering through still. But looking at 2017 to 2019, we saw an average of 515 total flights conducted by 6 different air tour operators each year. So again, as Vicki mentioned, the annual number of commercial air tours is currently limited by the IOA, or that 3,000 number, but there are no designated parameters on routes, times of day, altitude restrictions, and no procedures to establish no-fly periods for special events or other activities, no particular training or education requirements. That's the current condition in the park. Next slide, please. So in developing the ATMP today, again, the NPS and FAA have looked at the average number of annual flights flown over the park from 2017 to 2019. So looking at what's currently out there in terms of flight activity and tours. So the 3-year period, which I should note includes the highest recorded non-air tour recreational visits in park history. 2018 so far to date has seen the most recreational visits of any year in the park's almost 100-year history. Again, the average was 515. And so we're using that as our target in the draft plan in order to maintain but not reduce the number of total permissible flights from the status quo. Altitudes, essentially minimum altitude above ground level, or AGL, is raised in this plan to 2,600 feet from the current restrictions applicable to general aviation over non-developed areas. That will significantly take aircraft higher above the ground level, reducing noise to visitors on the ground. Designating of aircraft types will be specified for each operator, and so as operators upgrade their fleet, it gives us the opportunity to review and discuss with them options for different types of aircraft. Where there are no time or day of week restrictions currently, the plan will propose a restriction on flights until 2 hours after sunrise and up until 2 hours before sunset. The sunset and sunrise periods are important for wildlife. There are also times when we see high concentrations of visitors along the rim seeking those periods for photography, natural beauty, and natural quiet. And by protecting those, we help separate those user impacts from aircraft operations. There are no day of week restrictions proposed currently, but under the plan, the NPS could, in the future, if situations changed, propose temporary no-fly periods for special events or conditions. And the new plan will, of course, as noted on the chart there, will continue semi-annual reporting requirements, but also require regular operator trainings and meetings with the agency going forward. And we think this is very important to maintain communication, identify issues early, and work with operators to correct them. Next slide, please. This is the map of the proposed air tour routes. I'm sure many of you have seen this if you've been to our Pepsi site to make comments or on social media. And I will tell you that one of the immediate responses we had to this map was it makes the airspace over the park look very busy and very crowded. Please note that this map shows all of the assigned routes for all the permitted operators in relation to one another. And this map was, but does not necessarily capture the relative number of flights at any given time on any given route. In other words, some of these routes are very busy, or where most of the flights are on a limited number of routes, and other routes see very little use. These routes were developed by the FAA in consultation with the Park Service in an effort to help, as much as possible, preserve the existing routes that the current operators utilize in order to allow them to maintain the same operations and flights they found successful today, with the addition that the Park Service is asked to, again, raise the altitude of these flights significantly above ground level to take them further away from viewpoints and birds and other wildlife on the ground. We realize that this is a complicated map to read. So on the park's Pepsi site that we've already referenced, when you go into the plan itself, if you click on the link for the plan, you will now find links to a set of plans, or excuse me, a set of maps, each one with the different routes separated onto an individual map. So you can see each company's routes on one of 6 different maps. We hope that helps to clarify the proposal a little bit. I realize this is a really busy map and a little hard to read. Next slide, please. So again, just to sort of recap our key points, the annual flight limits are intended to protect soundscapes, visitor experience, cultural resources, wilderness character, and wildlife. I've noted again here that the commercial air tours flying no lower than 2,600 feet above ground level complies with guidance for raptor protection, so hawks, eagles, that sort of thing, including threatened, endangered, and migratory birds in guidelines from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So again, taking those aircraft higher, reducing impacts to humans, but also potential impacts to wildlife. Next slide. We hope that this will in turn reduce the intensity of air tour noise to visitor on the ground, which will improve wilderness character and visitor experience. The total number of air tours proposed under this draft plan is consistent with the existing air tours reported over the park. So again, not a reduction in what we think we've seen over the last several years, but rather allowing current operators to maintain current level of operations and business opportunities. And then again, adding this piece of regular communication in the form of training and meetings with operators and the agencies to identify issues and talk about them together and come up with successful resolutions going forward. With that, I would like to turn this time back over to Keith Lusk from the FAA again to further discuss the planning process.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Eilerin. Really appreciate your input and details on the park resources, the background and history, as well as the draft air tour management plan itself. I'm going to talk a little bit now about environmental compliance. As I mentioned on one of my earlier slides, the agencies need to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. The development of the air tour management plan is considered a federal action and is subject to requirements of NEPA. Basically, NEPA requires agency to consider the effects of their action. In this case, the action is the development of the air tour management plan, the effect that it would have on the human and natural environment. And what we're talking about, the effects on the human and natural environment, are basically stemming from the air tours themselves in terms of the routes and the altitudes and the frequency and those types of considerations that are outlined in the plan. We need to take into account those potential effects on the human and natural environment. We also need to determine the appropriate level of environmental review. There's various levels of environmental review under NEPA. There are categorically excluded actions. There are, in terms of documentation and analysis, environmental assessments, there's environmental impact statements. So there's different levels or tiers, if you will, of environmental analysis. We're required to prepare associated environmental review documents as part of this process. At this time, the FAA and the Park Service are considering developing this air tour management plan at Bryce Canyon National Park under a National Park Service categorical exclusion. The agencies will consider public comments on the air tour management plan, which we are taking now as part of the 30-day open public comment period running through October 3rd. We'll also consider information obtained during various consultation processes. We'll speak a little bit more to that shortly, but basically those consultations are in regards to Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, as well as Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. We'll also fully assess the environmental impacts before making a final decision on the appropriate level of environmental review. Now, there's a couple of, in addition to NEPA, there's a couple of additional special purpose laws that the agencies are required to comply with. That is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. So in regards to Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, the agencies are currently working to complete this consultation. We're well into that process during the development of this draft air tour management plan. And Section 106 basically is kind of a four-step process. The first thing you do is define the undertaking. In this case, the undertaking is the development of the air tour management plan, and identify participants. The agencies have been basically completed those first two tasks. We've identified the consulting parties. We've reached out to various federally recognized tribes, as well as state historic preservation offices as well. The next step is to determine the area of potential effects, or APE. And this is basically the geographic area within which the agencies think that the likely effects from the air tours would occur. That APE, or area of potential effects, is also determined in consultation with those consulting parties and tribes and other stakeholders as part of that process. In addition to identifying the area of potential effects, we also identify the historic properties within that geographic area. Then the next step would be to assess potential effects to those historic properties. And then finally, we would resolve adverse effects if we found any or determined any to occur to those historic properties. So we're certainly engaged in ongoing 106 consultations with the various stakeholders and tribes and state historic preservation offices, and we'll continue that effort. We will not finalize the air tour management plan until the Section 106 consultation process has been completed. With that, we can go to the next slide, and I will turn it back to Michelle.
Thank you, Keith. So as Keith had mentioned, the FAA and the NPS are complying with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, as they develop the draft ATMP. And this is to ensure that the proposed action does not jeopardize the existence of any species listed under ESA or result in destruction or adverse modification of designated critical habitat. And as Superintendent Ireland had alluded to earlier, the agencies have started informal consultation conversations with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the preliminary assessment by the agencies is not anticipating these types of impacts. Next slide, please. So as noted earlier, we are currently inviting comment from the public, tribes, other agencies, and all interested parties. And we're asking for comments by October 3rd. And I mentioned earlier, but comments can be submitted one of two ways, either online through the NPS public comment website, and you'll see the link on the screen here, or by mail to the address also listed on the screen. And this address, if you don't capture it now, can be found on the Parks Pepsi page. And just a reminder that the agencies are not accepting public comment via email. I'd also like to let you know that there is a FAQ, a frequently asked questions document that's posted on the Parks Pepsi page, right alongside the draft ATMP. And as Superintendent Ireland mentioned earlier, there's also very specific maps that we have posted. And if somebody from FAA could just go ahead and drop the link to the Pepsi page into the social media platforms, would be appreciated. Next slide, please. Following the end of this public comment period, the FAA and the NPS will then review all of the comments that are received and use them to inform the final ATMP. We'll continue to coordinate and complete tribal Section 106 and the Section 7 consultations, and they'll conclude the NEPA process by signing a decision document. And once all of that's wrapped up, the ATMP will be considered complete, and it'll be available on both the FAA and the NPS websites. FAA will then follow up by updating the operation specifications for each air tour operator. Next slide, please. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of the presenters and now turn us over into the Q&A portion of the meeting. For those of you that may have joined during the presentations, my name is Michelle Carter. I am an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'm serving as the moderator for the meeting this afternoon. And if you didn't catch it earlier, if you have a question you would like to submit, you can post it into the Google form using the link that FAA has shared in the chat area of whichever social media platform you're using. We also wanted to just give a quick reminder that the questions that are received as part of the meeting this afternoon will be considered by the agencies as they continue drafting the ATMPs, but we're asking for formal comments, if you want them considered as part of the record, to be submitted via the PEPC site, the Park Planning and Public Review site. Either submit those official comments through Pepsi or to the mailing address. And just another plug reminder that those comments need to be received on or before October 3rd. I also mentioned earlier that the total length of the meeting is going to be 90 minutes and we plan to adjourn at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. In the event that we get through the questions, and kind of have a lull, we'll keep the meeting open until 4 p.m. so that you have time to maybe reflect on the presentations or reflect on some of the responses that you've heard to the questions that have been submitted, and you can keep the questions coming in. If we have a lull of a period, we might go off camera and off mic for just a moment to allow folks to get everything submitted. And with that, it does look like we have had some questions start coming in. So we'll go over here first. We'll pass the first question over to Keith. They're asking, can the park just not do a plan?
Thanks, Michelle. Basically, we have to do a plan. The National Parks Air Tour Management Act requires that the agencies develop an air tour management plan or a voluntary agreement at any park for which we've received applications to conduct commercial air tour operations. As I'd mentioned previously, there was there's actually 9 existing air tour operators at Bryce Canyon National Park who applied for operating authority to the FAA. We granted all those 9 air tour operators with interim operating authority to continue to allow them to do tours until such time as the agencies develop the ATMP. The only exclusion to developing a plan would be if this park was on the exempt park list, which it is not, because it has more than 50 annual commercial air tour operations at the park. As Superintendent Ireland mentioned, there's roughly in the neighborhood of a little over 500 annual tours based on the 2017 to 2019 reporting information that we have. And actually, without a plan, what would continue to occur? The operators would be allowed to fly basically under their interim operating authority, their annual not to exceed number, but there wouldn't be any required routes or altitudes associated with that, or any time of day restrictions or requirements for meetings or potential shutdowns for special events or things like that. So developing the plan here would provide these additional measures above and beyond current conditions. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that, Keith. Okay. We have another question now that we'll pass over to Vicki. And the question is, why do you want to start air tours over the park?
Well, thanks for the question. As we've mentioned previously, air tours have been happening over Bryce for over 20 years. So it's not a new program. They've been operating under interim operating authority since about 2003. There just wasn't any specified routes or altitudes or any other restrictions on those except for the IOA number per year. So as we've also mentioned too, that they're authorized to fly up to 3,131 tours per year under that IOA. 3-year average from 2017 to 2019 is 515 commercial air tours per year. And that's what's being proposed in this draft plan, which is a reduction from the maximum allowed, but based on existing conditions. So the draft air tour management plan also includes the conditions to protect natural and cultural resources and visitor experience that includes specifying the routes, altitudes, aircraft type, time of day, restrictions, and restrictions for particular events. Without an air tour management plan, none of those conditions would be put into place. I hope that answered the question, and thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Vicki. Okay, looks like we still have some questions coming in. We'll go with this next one back over to Keith here. Well, he popped on. Thanks, Keith. This decision is being made by a categorical exclusion, which requires a supporting document. And they're asking, will this document be made available to the public prior to the end of the public comment period?
So as the commenter dutifully notes, that agencies are currently considering the complying with NEPA through the use of a categorical exclusion. As I mentioned in one of my later slides, however, we will be considering public comments, information obtained during consultation processes, as well as fully assessing the environmental impacts before we make a final determination on the NEPA pathway, which NEPA pathway is appropriate for this action. The agencies, assuming we go forward with a categorical exclusion, the agencies will make the final categorical exclusion documentation publicly available when the final ATMP is published. If you have comments during this 30-day comment period before October 3rd about the appropriate NEPA pathway for this ATMP, or about the effects or ways to mitigate effects, please include them in your formal comments on this draft ATMP, as Michelle has provided where that site is to the National Park Service Pepsi site for you to submit your comments, or the mailing address. And I'm sure she'll mention that again before we close tonight. So hopefully that answers the question. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Keith. Okay, so Vicki, we have a question here. They're asking if the slides in the presentation will be made available to the public and how they can get a copy. So you want to share a little bit of information on that?
Sure, Michelle. Thanks for the question. Yes, a 508 compliant PDF document of the slides from today's meeting will be available on the park's Pepsi site. We anticipate having them uploaded and available tomorrow. And also to note that this meeting is being recorded, and that recording will also be available on the Parks Pepsi site. And so, Michelle, I don't know if you can go over that at the end of the meeting, again, that Pepsi site, so people can make their comments and also find, go back later and find the PowerPoint slides.
Yep, thanks, Vicki. And we'll mention it again later in the presentation, and we'll drop links back in case folks may have missed that. Okay, this next question, we'll go back over to Keith. And Keith, they're noting first that in January of 2006, the Government Accountability Office issued a report on the ATMP process that stated a lack of overflight monitoring was a severe problem. And so they're asking, will there be any way to audit the semi-annual reports that are submitted by the air tour operators?
Thank you, Michelle. So as I mentioned in kind of the background discussion about the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, there were some amendment provisions in 2012, one of which, in addition to identifying exempt parks with 50 or fewer annual air tours, also laid out reporting requirements. And that was the first time that the agencies really had current data on the level of air tour operations at these park units. The only real number or other number, benchmark number that we had was the interim operating authority number that was based on what air tour operators were doing just prior to enactment of the act in 2000. So that 2012 reporting amendment provided us with the ability to ask air tour operators to submit on a quarterly basis. It's now been changed to semi-annual basis, a spreadsheet containing some information about the number of air tours that they conducted and over specific parks. So that has filled in a data gap that was open for a while for us. We will continue under this air tour management plan to have that semi-annual reporting requirement. Also of note in this air tour management plan is the requirement for flight monitoring data required to be submitted, as well as the annual reports. And that's in section 5.1 of the air tour management plan, in case you're interested in looking in that. So moving forward, that type of flight following technology will provide the agencies with a better capability to track commercial overflights and match that up with the reporting activity, the reporting submittals that we get from these air tour operators. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Keith. Okay. The next question, we'll pass it over to Vicki. And Vicki, they're asking if there is any section of the park where air tour noise will not be audible on a typical fair weather day.
Okay, thanks for that question. And I'm sorry, my video is not working really well right now. I'm going to turn it off, but hopefully you'll hear me. So thanks for that question. And how loud an air tour would be is to a visitor on the ground depends on a number of factors, which include the proximity to the flight path, the type of the aircraft, other sources of noise, and other surrounding landscape features. So a visitor that's under a flight path or near it is more likely to hear the aircraft passing overhead, but such other background sounds such as vehicles, people, other biological activities such as insects, wildlife, wind, precipitation can mask the sound of an aircraft, and also terrain features too, and buildings can also shield noise. So it just depends on where somebody is in the park and on what day and what the conditions are like. So I think, and actually just wanted to note too that those routes were raised up to 2,600 feet above ground level to reduce the noise effects on the ground.
Okay, thanks, Vicky. Sorry you're having trouble with video, but we could hear you loud and clear. So thanks for that. Okay. Let's see, we'll go down here to another question for Keith this time. How did you develop the proposal that 532 air tour operations annually is what Bryce needs versus the 3,131 2,000? Choosing to only use the 3 years of 2017 to 2019 when those are not what the IOA originally established. They're asking if we've just, or they're stating actually, I guess, that we've ignored the years 2000 to 2016.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. This air tour management plan basically stands up existing air tour operations conditions at the park with modifications to protect park resources and visitor experience. So the National Parks Air Tour Management Act required operators to submit semi-annual reports regarding the number of flights they conduct. I mentioned that in a response to a previous question. We have reporting information from 2013 to current date. The agencies have reviewed that in terms of looking at the recent air tour activity at each and every park where we've developed an air tour management plan. We've decided to select the 2017 to 2019 timeframe to utilize as a 3-year average because we think that's reflective of the most recently available data that we have, and that we can use that as a part of the planning process in developing the air tour management plan. Obviously, 2020 with the COVID pandemic, that was probably an outlier year in terms of air tour activity, assuming that probably air tour operations were down as part of the pandemic's effect on all kinds of business nationwide. So we did not include 2020 data. We included 2017 to 2019 data. As Superintendent Ireland mentioned, not only was visitor visitation at Bryce Canyon the highest, I think, in 2018 is what he mentioned, but in terms of looking at the numbers for Bryce Canyon, those numbers were fairly robust in the 2017 to 2019 timeframe for those operators. The questioner asked why we didn't look at any of the previous data. We didn't really have any previous data prior to or in between 2000 when the act came into effect in 2012 or 2013 when we stood up the reporting requirements. Why didn't we use interim operating? That was really based on operating conditions by the tour operators in the 1999 or using the 3-year average 1997 to 1999 timeframe. That's where you got that 3,000 number. Based on the reporting information, we're not seeing anywhere close to those numbers reflected over the course of the last 8 or so years of reporting the data. So we think that the 3-year average of 2017 to 2019 is a good representation of air tour conditions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Keith. We had a little connection blip on our screen sharing, as you may have seen us scrolling through the slides here. So just letting folks know that we're going to try to scroll back to the very last slide. Yeah, perfect. It's almost there. Well, anyway, you'll see us working in the forefront here to try to get that last slide up. We just want to make sure that we have displayed the link to the Pepsi page and the address in case folks have to drop off early and you want to jot that down. So thank you for that. Okay, so we have lots of questions that are continuing to come in. So thank you for being out there and getting questions submitted. For this next one, we'll go back over to Vicky. And they're asking, Vicky, which categorical exclusion we're using for the action.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for that question. I'll try my video again and hopefully it'll keep working this time. Yeah, the FAA and the NPS are developing the air tour plan. I'm sorry, I'm just going to turn this off again. Under an NPS categorical exclusion, which is A.3A1 from the National Environmental Policy Handbook that the NPS uses, and it says that it allows changes or amendments to an approved action when such changes will cause no or only minimal environmental impact. Because the proposed action is very similar to existing air tour operations and includes new operating parameters, impacts resulting from the effects of the proposed action would result in no or only minimal environmental impacts. In addition, the inclusion of new operating parameters such as the altitude restrictions, time of day restrictions, and quiet aircraft technology incentives would ensure that the park would only experience beneficial impacts compared to the environment compared to current conditions. The agencies will consider public comments on the air tour management plan, information obtained during consultations, and fully assess the environmental impacts before making the final determination on what NEPA pathway is appropriate. So if anyone has comments on the NEPA pathway, please send those in via Pepsi. And I think that hopefully that answers that question, and thanks, Michelle.
Great, thanks, Vicki. So for those of you out there, there's always a little bit of a delay between when the questions are submitted in the form and we actually are able to see them here on our end, and that looks like that's what's happening. I think that there are several people out there still, so we expect that you do have questions that you're in the process for submitting. So I'm going to go off video here just for a minute or two while you have time to get your questions typed in, and we'll come back on here in just a few moments to answer some more questions. So thank you. Great, thank you all for continuing to stay on the line. We have had a couple more questions come in. So we'll go with this first one here over to Keith. There's a statement that combined the national parks in Hawaii currently allow over 50,000 air tours a year, and will allowing air tour operators to maintain their present number of flights set a legal precedent that will allow these Hawaii overflights to continue.
Thank you for that, Michelle. So again, to reiterate, the purpose of tonight's meeting is really to discuss the Bryce Canyon draft air tour management plan and receive comments on this plan. I could offer that this air tour management plan does not set a precedent for other air tour management plans. The focus, however, their comments on the ATMPs that are already released, and not to assume that what an ATMP has not been released will include. And I think that's all I need to say on that. Thanks.
Thanks for the clarification, Keith. So we have a map question, and Vicki, we'll pass this over to you. The commenter is first thanking the teams for providing the individual operator maps, and they're asking if we'll also provide maps that include park trails and other popular visitor destinations.
Okay, thanks, Michelle, and thanks for that question. Detailed park maps that include those kinds of features can be found on the park's website at nps.gov/BRCA. Thanks.
Thanks, Vicki. Okay, Keith, we actually have another question over here for you. The commenter states that the NPS has collected years of data at Bryce Canyon in preparation for soundscape and air tour management plans. And they're asking, why does the ATMP not incorporate or reference that data or provide any other site-specific analysis? I think I may have gotten things mixed up here and not actually, I apologize. I got myself out of order a little bit here. Keith, my apologies for this. I got a little bit confused. My apologies to those of you out there. Let me get myself reordered here. Just a second. I'll be back on. Again, my apologies to those of you out there for getting myself confused about the order of things here. But we will have Keith go ahead and come back on with the question I was supposed to ask of the orders. One of the original plaintiffs in the U.S. District of Appeals case was a Bryce Canyon National Park Service employee who documented the contrails that made photographing the park and its natural state nearly impossible. And they're asking, does the ATMP address that problem?
It does not address that issue to our knowledge. The types of aircraft that are provided for in this air tour management plan to do tours over Bryce Canyon do not generate contrails. Those are typically generated by larger commercial jet propelled aircraft at higher altitudes. Here we're looking at both smaller rotor and fixed wing aircraft, but not kind of jet engine commercial airline activity at the much higher altitudes. And that's typically where contrails come from. Thank you.
Okay. Actually bring the park on now. Bring on Superintendent Ireland for the next question. They're asking, is the ATMP initiative being led by complaints of aircraft noise? And if so, how many documented complaints has the park received and how are they recorded?
Oh, well, thanks, Michelle. I'm happy to take that one. All complaints usually find their way to my desk. The ATMP initiative is being prepared under the requirements of NAPATMA, as we've discussed, the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. And also now our current process, of course, is also under the court order to complete these plans. We don't track complaints by topic. I do receive complaints on various topics throughout the year, and a few of those do involve aircraft noise, but we don't track those or record those separately, and that's not what's driving this process at this time.
Thank you. Okay. Again, my apologies for getting out of order here, but we're ready for the question that I read earlier, and we'll pass it over to Vicki. I'll repeat it. They're asking, or they're noting that the NPS has collected years of data at Bryce in preparation for soundscape and air tour management plans. And why does the ATMP not incorporate or reference that data or provide any other site-specific analysis?
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for that question. And I'll just give a little bit of a really brief summary of how the NPS collects acoustic data. We collect it for generally 30 days at a time in different seasons of the year and at different locations throughout a park based on the land cover type, perhaps the management zone of the park. So we're not out there conducting or collecting data for a whole year continuously. So I wouldn't characterize what we have in terms of acoustic data for Bryce as years worth of data. It was collected from a period of time from 2009 through 2010. And like I said, those systems were deployed for approximately 30 days. And also that data was put into a report, which we do have on our NPS IRMA site, which I tried to read one of these off the other night, and the link is very long. So if somebody wants that, just let us know. We'll email it to you directly. So regarding how we did this air tour management plan, the draft plan is not a NEPA document. It is actually describing the conditions for the conduct of air tours over the park. We did do an analysis that used that acoustic data. And, as we mentioned earlier, we're considering the use of a categorical exclusion, which it's also falls into the category of a documented categorical exclusion. If we make a determination that that's the NEPA pathway we're going to use, when we publish the final air tour management plan, we will also publish the categorical exclusion documentation, which will show how we use that acoustic data. I hope that answered the question. Back to you, Michelle.
Okay, thanks, Vicki. Looks like we still have folks out there, and looks like there's still some questions like maybe that are getting processed. Actually, we did just have one come here. We'll have Keith come on for this. They're asking, why does the ATMP for Bryce Canyon not analyze a suite of alternatives, including a no air tour alternative, so that the public can better understand how current conditions are impacting the natural and cultural resources and visitor experience, particularly given the history of visitor complaints under current air tour operations?
So this draft air tour management plan basically authorizes up to 515 annual air tours, as opposed to the over 3,100 that were granted under interim operating authority. That's kind of the agency's draft plan. Superintendent Ireland ran through a lot of the other requirements as part of that plan, some of the measures to protect park resources and their experience, from raising the altitudes to time of day restrictions, shutdowns for special events. So we think we have a good plan. We're asking for your comments on that draft plan. Obviously, we may not have thought of everything, or may not have considered some items that folks may want to bring up and have us consider. So we would strongly urge you, while we're still in the midst of this 30-day public comment period, to submit any types of these specific comments to the planning park environmental park comment site, the Pepsi site that Michelle has thrown up there a couple times, and will probably do so at the end of the meeting tonight. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Keith. So we it looks like there's still folks out there. We'll give a little bit of time again to give you time to get the questions typed in and get them over on our end where we can see them. So we have about a little over 10 minutes left in the meeting. So please continue to submit the questions, and once we have them available here on our end, we'll come back on and provide some answers. So thank you. Okay. I have a question here that we'll pass over to Keith. The question is, if they're asking precisely where does it say in the act that the agencies, both the PA and the NPS, can pick 3 arbitrary years to determine new allocations?
It doesn't say anywhere in the act, how we determine new allocations. It gives the agencies wide deference and discretion in terms of how we develop an air tour management plan. Basically, you have to go back to what are the objectives of an air tour management plan? It's to protect park resources, to prevent significant adverse impacts on the natural environment, cultural resources, visitor experience, and that's what the agencies tried to do. I think in a previous question, I laid out kind of the rationale and the basis for why the agencies felt that 2017 to 2019 numbers based on actual reporting data, actual recent reporting data, were a pretty good foundational baseline to document kind of current conditions. They're certainly much different than the interim operating authority numbers that were granted based on the air tour operations that operators conducted in the 1997 through 1999 or 1999 timeframe upon which interim operating authority numbers were granted. So we did throw out the COVID year of 2020. We felt that was a down year, but again, really the agencies were trying to meet the objectives and the purpose and need for developing this plan to protect park resources, while also allowing the air tour operators to provide commercial air tours. It was based on this recent reporting data, and we felt that those numbers provided a good basis for the plan. If you have different thoughts on that or would like to comment, please submit something directly to the Pepsi site in the remaining days up through October 3rd while we're receiving the comments, and we can analyze and review those comments that are submitted. So thank you.
Vicki, we have a question here that we'll pass over to you now. So it's a follow-up question, and they're asking if the NPS has the capability to import aircraft route data that's recorded into the NPS GIS systems for analysis.
Thanks for that question. I'm not a GIS expert or user, so I can't answer that question real, specifically. However, we do process flight tracking data that is already can be, recorded from the ADS-B systems that aircraft have on board, and we also are looking at ways to conduct additional analysis of any flight reporting data that will be provided under an ATMP. Thanks.
Okay. Let's see, this next question, we'll pass it back over to Keith. Commenter is saying, I'm curious to know how the above ground level is measured. For example, is it from the ground at the top of the canyon or the top of each hoodoo, and or from the bottom of each ravine, or from some other point? There's such a geographically complicated area. They're wondering if there's a consistent elevational baseline.
Yeah, I understand the kind of the trickiness of that. That's a great question. And basically for purposes of development of this air tour management plan and complying with the provisions in this act, basically above ground level references the topographic high point within a half mile of the associated flight path that is shown on the map. So each respective route there would be AGL would reference the topographic high point within a half mile of that flight path. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thanks, Keith. So we actually are coming to the end of our meeting. I mentioned earlier that I'll be sharing a phone number that you can call for if you had questions that were not answered. So grab a pen. But in the meantime, I actually would like to turn it back over to Superintendent Ireland for some of his closing remarks.
Well, thanks again, Michelle. And thank you everybody for hanging in there with us throughout this session. I just wanted to end with a concluding thought. And, you know, I often go back to this well-known quote, often quoted from Utah author Wallace Stegner in 1983. National parks are the best idea we ever had. Absolutely American, absolutely democratic. They reflect us at our best rather than our worst. We're reflecting on that Stegner quote in a recent essay. Alan Spears, a park advocate with the National Parks Conservation Association, recently wrote, in part, "I think that our national parks are like most of the other laudable, lofty ideals created by Americans, an ever-evolving concept filled with great promise and in need of constant stewardship. If our job as citizens is to help create a more perfect union, then it makes sense that we should all have a role in creating a more perfect national park system." And I thank you again. You have all taken up time this afternoon, time to make comments, time to review our plans. You have actively taken up this role of becoming engaged citizens in taking on a tough challenge. And I know we've got lots of different opinions and ideas around this topic of air tours in national parks, but I thank you for taking up the role. We appreciate it. I promise to listen to all of your comments and do our best to deal with them as best we can as we strive to be good stewards for your public land. So thank you again this afternoon. Michelle?
Thanks, Jim. So in closing, and a reminder, if anyone online joined us late, I wanted to make sure you know that there is a frequently asked questions document that's posted with the draft ATMP, along with those specific route maps. And if you had a question that wasn't answered, Superintendent Ireland said you can contact him directly. And that phone number is 435-834-4700. Again, that phone number is 435-834-4700. And I believe FAA is going to go ahead and drop that phone number into the chat feature too. And just to note that that contact information is being shared for clarifying questions. If you have a comment that you want to be submitted as part of the official record, you'll submit it via the Pepsi site, the links here on this page, or sent to the mailing address on or before October 3rd of this year. So all of those out there still, thank you so much for your participation. We, on the behalf of FAA and the National Park Service, we look forward to hearing from you, and we hope you have a good rest of your evening. Take care.